as you can see, I don't like what I do at all. But I have to say, I am so incredibly fortunate that I get to work alongside all of those incredible people. If you're unaware, Dr. Michael Thorpe and Dr. Shelby Harris were two of the people who trained me. And so clearly there's a bug there. But really I'm quite fortunate that I've had such great mentors over the years who have really helped me to recognize the needs in this space. What I'm really excited about in regards to this particular forum I had alluded to earlier is that no great change can occur in isolation. It can't occur without involving all the appropriate key stakeholders that can lead to both the barriers as well as the opportunities to getting to the outcomes we want to have. So with that, this second panel, I think, again, is going to be a unique panel that the goal is not to be adversarial, but to really be ideating on how do we all sit at the table and figure out a path forward to address the barriers that were just discussed, and how do we create an accountability structure to be successful in doing so. So with that, we have Mostafa Kamal, President and CEO of Prime Therapeutics. Thank you so much. We have Mark Ray Tancredi, who is the Divisional Vice President of Pharma Relations and Specialty Pharmacy Development at Walgreens. And then Ross Hoffman, who is the former CMO at Centene. And your current job role, again?
It's CMO at FFF Enterprises.
Exactly. I wanted to make sure it wasn't on my paper,
Sure.
so. Awesome. So, gentlemen, first I want to talk about the burden of disease and the risk to insure. And I think that this is a really important conversation because of the fact that when looking at just the insurance paradigm in general, it is about risk mitigation. It's about achieving the optimal health for individuals, but also doing it in the most cost-effective way. And I think we're seeing this spill over across healthcare of saying we want value-based outcomes. We want to see that the patient does better, but we want to also make sure it's in the most fiscally responsible way. When looking at an individual's course who has narcolepsy, we have lots of retrospective claims data, we have EHR data that demonstrates that individuals with narcolepsy many times have multiple other comorbid diseases. But also you've heard there's this delay in diagnosis, seeing multiple different specialists, getting lots of tests that may be unnecessary. What are the thoughts on the impact that narcolepsy has on cost of care and resource utilization? What do you think in regards to that?
Well, I'll start, and my colleague, Dr. Hoffman, will have a lot more to say about it. But first of all, I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I think that educating participants in the supply chain about the complexities and the challenges of conditions like these and others is really important in order for us to come up with better solutions and to continue to improve. I always tell my team it's not about being adversarial, it's about really being grounded in principles such as assume positive intent, seek to understand before you seek to create understanding, and be curious and constructive in the dialogue. And so I really appreciate the prior panel and the way that that conversation went. It was very helpful and managed, I think, in a very effective way. So thank you for that. At the end of the day, you're right. The bottom line is each part of the supply chain has its own pressures. When you think about health plans and PBMs who work for health plans to manage affordability, they've got fixed premium dollars that they need to deploy in ways to manage an entire population. And the evolution, I think everyone is interested in going to value-based care and focusing on pay for performance, fee for outcomes versus fee for service. The barriers tend to be data, the fragmentation in the system to be able to actually track a patient longitudinally, and then also the fact that you've got people moving from plan to plan, and how long are you really insuring someone for what time period, who gets the benefit of that value-based outcome. So these are challenges that we have to work together to overcome, and the only way we can do that is if we connect all of these components, and I think it starts with ultimately data.
Sure.
But I can tell you that the track that we're on is unsustainable as a healthcare system in the United States. You've got premiums increasing, costs are increasing. You have, when I started in this business 20 years ago, pharmacy was 10 cents of every premium dollar, and now it's 35 cents of every premium dollar. So you can imagine health plans continue to need to cover more with less. And I think value-based solutions, truly accountable value-based solutions, meaning if the product doesn't work, we don't pay for it. Not except in this case, except in that case. There's a lot of that goes on today, which ultimately doesn't result in true value-based care. And I think those are some of the things we have to overcome.
Sure. And I think one of the challenges coming from the clinician side is fully recognizing a fee-for-service strategy is just never successful, right? You don't have the right accountability structure. It's just saying, how many widgets have I seen? The value-based care paradigm, the part that I struggle with, and I agree, I'm a very data-driven individual as well, is that it's still a very fiscally motivated strategy that doesn't actually put the patient as the primary focus. And so as you had heard earlier, there are sometimes these outcomes that what is the data or metric that we can drive at? And it's not saying that that's necessarily right or wrong. It's saying that there's going to be new data that needs to be generated that's coming from the patient. I've been privileged to be a part of different FDA listening sessions where patients are describing, this is why these need to be a part of clinical trials, patient-reported outcomes. That may be more important than seeing this incremental change on an MWT. But as had been stated, the ability to go to school every day, go to work, be able to drive, and how do we start driving to those types of measures so that we can say, like, this does make sense for you to be on it. And then also, are there differences in longer term that, to your point, if you're not on that insurance anymore, how do I see the reward there?
Yeah, and I'd add that with every single category, there are comorbidities and a predisposition to other diseases that are also expensive when it comes to narcolepsy or anything else. So
Sure.
When you think about outcomes, in addition to the components that you talked about, go to school every day, feeling better,
Sure.
there's also avoiding other comorbidities such as a lot of mental health issues as well. So we just got to bring all the data together and figure out how to do it in a fair way.
Yes, no, I totally agree. All right, let's hear what you got to say.
So I've spent time inside the payer world and the PBM world, and as a provider and as an orphan disease parent. So bring a number of different perspectives to my comments. The structural problems are big, and this is a fifth of the economy, healthcare. So as much as I am a flag waver for value-based care, I'm not holding my breath for that because there are, in my opinion, there are perverse incentives across the ecosystem, including with physicians. Some physician practices more than others. So there's no one to vilify in particular here. It's just that there's a stuckness, as in any industrial complex, which renders itself resistant to change. And so I want to be really careful to offer comments here that are not stuck in being a description of the problem, but hopefully action-oriented. I'm a cardiologist. I like to fix things, and action-oriented. So there's something that there's a playbook around this, and I think there is one. And some of the panelists earlier made some comments along those lines. So I think there's power in numbers, and having been inside of advocacy groups and seen some of the dynamics there, including the intra-disease state advocacy groups, which sometimes can compete with one another. I think using the power of numbers, solidarity within the disease state, and then solidarity within rare diseases overall, where we're talking about 30, 40 million people as opposed to a much smaller number, I think the voice can be better heard. Certainly the FDA is aligned with that thinking. And then finding the commonalities that that all of those groups have, and creating solutions against that. So one might imagine a future, and this is beginning to happen in current state, where there's less of a separation between specialist and primary care and access to that information. Some of it's going direct to patient through Gen AI, and there are models emerging that can create greater access to specialists. I mean, this is the world that you live in. And so I think there are models that can be pursued along those lines. Similarly, taking off on Mostafa's comments around data, I think advocacy groups as a whole have made a reasonable contribution to the library of information that we have from a medical evidence point of view. So speak to your power, and if there's alignment between the physicians and the patients and the advocacy group, if there's enough potential energy there, you can turn that into kinetic and actually make some things happen. And so advocacy groups have been worked with industry and independently in creating registries to look at some of the outcomes, to tell the story, to then hold an audience with a multi-payer stakeholder group, for example, and say, you are all data-driven animals. That's how you think. That's how you've all been trained. The clinicians with inside the payers and the finance people too. And then tell a story. And with that registry data, one could then look at the policies that the various payers have and look at the spectrum of them, which is a problem, and try to find some common path that then leads to a rational joint statement, perhaps a white paper, that creates a common thread and a roadmap to move forward from. And then in the world of rapid innovation in this fourth industrial revolution, we can then together begin to iterate on that and include the patient's voice in there, but then also the provider's voice, and then also the payer's voice. We do the types of things that you see coming in from the payer world, and I'm sure you see this as a consultant as well as a practitioner, and some of the panelists mentioned this previously. There's a wide spectrum of clinical expertise, and the patient journeys look very different, and so there actually is some very strong common sense around wanting to unify what a diagnostic protocol looks like and trying to stick to that. It should not be mandated. We need physician judgment. We need to strengthen the trust between physician and patients. And payers in the middle don't help that way. But their intent is not to be in the middle. The intent is to avoid sort of never events, egregious kinds of things. And so threading that needle where you're actually accomplishing the rational goal and not punishing the good actors is something to be avoided. So the last comment I'll add to that, speaking to end with on a positive note, is the good actors have an awesome play here. So anytime you have experts in a field with data where they can tell their story and show it to a group of policymakers, they may be payers, they may not be, you can begin to come up with a care pathway that reasonable people will agree to. And you can do then other administrative things from gold carding perspectives and so on, and track data. So in a world where we have ambient monitoring of every visit and we have AI analytics that are being applied to those today to actually drive administrative efficiency, but then also to drive better decisioning. And this is all being actively built, and I have visibility into lots of this. We will be able to actually show that these gold-carded practices are or are not doing as well as we had hoped them to be. And I think in doing so, you can then set a direction for the field. But it will take time because the access to subspecialists is limited. And so I think there's just additional work to be done there. And the more that the advocacy groups can help craft that that game plan, the more success we can see. And certainly there are predicate models within advocacy as far as venture philanthropy goes and others that have built real business metrics around accomplishing these kinds of goals.
In regards to, again, the burden of disease, the risk to insure, how do we utilize, because I'm hearing some really great concepts around being able to frame out gold-carded institutions who perhaps have a higher likelihood of encountering these type of patient, optimizing their treatment. So my initial response is worry that will further drive barriers in care, because you're going to have more of the haves than the have-nots, potentially by making more kind of a perception that you can only get access to good care in some of these centers versus people who are acting more locally. And this is something that I think every healthcare system is trying to overcome in regards to social determinants of health, diversity, equity, inclusion, et cetera. Of that, if it takes me longer because I see Dr. Smith, who's in middle of nowhere, versus I go to Dr. Jones, who's a part of this gold card place, that it's going to take you longer to get to the drug that actually might make the most impact versus if you go to this other place. And the reason I state this is because one of the things that I am very active in is in social media, and have been able to participate in things like social media listening and do natural language processing, creating novel disease concept maps, being able to understand what the patient journey is. And you see this segregation in care. You've mentioned registries, and I'm a scientific advisor for one of the largest registries, one in this space, but also they do a bunch of different global registries. The challenge with registries most typically is they're representative of what we know about the disorder, and we ask the questions that we already know the anticipated answer to, and so therefore we still bias the direction. We're starting to use some of this learning from natural language processing on the social media to understand, do you think that there's a role for, as we're thinking about, again, building out this ecosystem and elevating the patient voice, and recognizing that there are differences in these risk profiles for individuals of utilizing something like social media to inform on what are we missing out on? Because there's incredible data of people self-reporting to whether it's Facebook, Reddit, you name it. And you can map out when they got diagnosed, what their symptoms looked like to be able to predict it, what they look like afterwards. How can we leverage that type of information?
It is being leveraged there are some companies that are using non-traditional sources of data to help define the patient journey. Mm-hmm. From what I've seen is that some of these tools are being sold into pharma marketing organizations as far as supporting some of their market access initiatives, and also some of their clinical teams. From a messaging point of view. So the good news is that's happening. I'd say in addition, we're seeing automation on the prior authorization side. As recently as this week, I met with some innovators who are using tools with agents that can make auto calls to physician practices or auto query other databases, such as pharmacy claims, though it might be a medical request, to look at whether a patient has actually been on a prior therapy, and get the bots to kind of communicate with one another to reduce the administrative burden, increase the speed to approval of a given request. And one of the concepts that is being floated, and this will require some investment, is actually to take all of that data and then in the background just continue to analyze. So when one looks at the request and is able to identify a phenotype of multiple failed therapies, multiple physicians, I mean, you could engineer the query in such a manner that you could identify someone who's probably been misdiagnosed, mm-hmm. or mistreated, or both. And you could actually take all of that and do something with that information. And so it's not a reach. So that's already in the works. So it's not a reach to then for those organizations to say, all right, next layer is take non-traditional sources of data and include that.
Yeah.
So these are all, googly, Microsoft, Apple kinds of people who are working inside of healthcare and working with MD, PhD types in dyadic relationships with engineers so that you can actually produce these kinds of things and get to the right answers in a shorter period of time. So as I don't mean to sugarcoat this, it's hard to be a patient now, and it's really sad to me. So I went out and practiced in Grand Junction, Colorado, after I finished training in Boston, because I was looking for years for the Happy Valley to practice in, and I was lucky enough to do that. We didn't have any of this nonsense in sort of treating our patients, and what I've witnessed is actually a degradation in the physician experience, in the patient experience, and the nursing experience, and so on. There's all of this, and the cost has continued to rise, and so now we have this management problem, and it's a fifth of the economy. And so again, not to say that there are any villains, but we have all of this additional information. I think it's an important message. We have more data, but we're not really better off, So I think it's really critical that the folks who are at the where the rubber meets the road, which is the physicians and the patients, like that's where the real care happens. If it's not working there, then it's not working. And that also speaks to the power of the people in this room, is to construct solutions that you are certain are actually driving value at that level, and then show that last mile value to every other rational actor in the system, and they will follow along with you. It's a lot of work. There's a ton of stakeholders. It's an industrial complex. It'll take time, but I finally, after this much time trying to reform the system and failing, I think I'm at a point of great optimism given the tools that we have. I mean, this is a really transformational time.
Yeah, and I think what I'm hearing you say is we have the data to analyze. However, the data also is representative of all the silos, which is why you need to have all these key players come together. And to your point, it's going to require investment. And the question becomes, how do we pay for that, and what's the return, and who's investing in that in order to be able to access? Because if you're on one side generating, this may be a misdiagnosis, how is that getting communicated back to the healthcare system, right? And so really it is solving for this ecosystem approach to be able to transform completely. And I think, Ray, this is also going to be coming from pharmacy, right? I mean, if you think about something like Walgreens, between their subspecialty pharmacy and then what's in their regular retail stores, that's a huge contributor to thinking about what this paradigm could look like.
As a pharmacist, I want to say, Katie, your story was uplifting, was very powerful. And when I think about pharmacy, where do we play, right? I think the pharmacist really has to have an empathetic and educational approach, right? When you think of the pharmacist, they're the first line. A patient journey does not start when that prescription is either presented to a pharmacist or sent into a specialty pharmacy. The pharmacist has to realize that that patient has gone through misdiagnosis, they've gone through years of looking at that diagnosis, and have the ability not to be an issue in that whole. I see the great work that you're all doing with payers and so on. We have to make sure that we're advocating for the patients, whether it's through prior authorizations, copay assistance, foundational assistance, or other areas. When I think of all the misdiagnosis, I've taken some time over the last week to learn about this disease, and I admit, or this condition, I admit I don't know everything. But I also looked at, I'm a certified specialty pharmacist. I believe it's incumbent even upon the industry and the specialty certification board that I belong to really start to educate the pharmacy world about narcolepsy. I think it's real easy to take in a prescription and fill it and say, oh, it's got a prior authorization, it'll take me this long. Mm-hmm. But really an empathetic approach to help that patient and guide them through the process and make sure there's the least amount of barriers that are put up by anybody. And it's not to cast any aspersions on PBMs or payers, it's just the reality of the world. And that pharmacists could be an impactful place in that journey for the patient. And I think it's, as a pharmacist, when I hear these stories, and I deal a lot in rare and orphan diseases, oncology, multiple sclerosis, and even smaller diseases, and every story is really impactful. And I think we, as an industry, I think the Specialty Pharmacy Certification Board and other areas can bring that empathetic approach. And I think from a Walgreens perspective, the pharmacists are on board. We're doing even activities at the pharmacy level where we're trying to take workload out of that pharmacy for refills, et cetera, so that the pharmacist can actually spend more time with the patient. And they've been saying that since I got out of school in 1983. but I think it's really closer.
We're a little close.
I think we're closer to reality. They always said, I'm ready to be able to, you're going to be able to work at the top of your license, right? And I don't fill prescriptions anymore, but I still take visits to the pharmacies. And I think we're getting there. I think that's really important. And when I look at the condition of narcolepsy, this is really a place to start. There are so many issues that we can overcome and not be the barrier where there's already been barriers.
Yeah.
So from my perspective and pharmacy, I think it's a key learning for all of us and to really assist, whether it's the payers, the PBMs, and the physicians, and even pharma who's bringing, when you think of this, pharma has done a good job, and the pipeline is pretty robust in this particular space, right? And there's a lot of new therapies and transcendental therapies that we're going to see. I think it's really incumbent upon us to ensure that we know those therapies, educate ourselves, and take care of the patients. And I think Walgreens will be at the forefront of that.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that we're already seeing the pharmacists take on a bigger role, at least within the healthcare system, more on the inpatient than on the outpatient side. We're starting to see it transform on the outpatient side. But it's important because as we're seeing advancement in medicine, it is becoming much more complex to manage just as the clinician. And then in terms of all of the different prescriptions or formulations, et cetera, the nuance is what the pharmacist has really great expertise in. So the pharmacist rounds with us on the inpatient side and really will review and give guidance. On the outpatient side, we now are even starting to see that being implemented, especially when we're talking about like infusion therapies, et cetera. But I think that is a really critical role. And at this point, on the outpatient side, we really only see a model like that if there's a REMS program associated. We don't necessarily see that same model being applied across the board. And I think that could be very helpful to have specific expertise like that.
Yeah, and when you think about the narcolepsy space and the new products, over the next 7 years up to 2031, I saw that this space could have $7 billion in sales for drug therapies. And that's over double what it is today. So pharmacy better be ready to take care of these patients, right? It's real important. You're going to see more patients diagnosed. I've been told a stat that maybe only 25% of narcolepsy patients are actually diagnosed with narcolepsy at some point in time. So as we begin to educate the space, pharmacists really need to understand that they're going to have an influx of patients, be able to take it, whether it's specialty pharmacy or retail pharmacy. And now we have what we call community-based specialty pharmacies, where they're closer to the patients. They're in medical office buildings, they're in healthcare institutions, and where key opinion leaders sit. So they're going to be seeing more prescriptions, and they need to be educated to take care of these patients at all times, but especially when they're getting their first fill.
Definitely.
I think that's really the key that pharmacy will be educated on.
Yeah. I want to go into the kind of diagnostic debacle, but I also want to have it parallel to the therapeutic landscape. So I think that you probably had heard me state earlier that as a neurologist, there's many other diagnoses that I approach where it's symptom driven and I may not have the diagnostic test that is consistent. And so I gave the example of I have a person who has a history that's consistent with epilepsy, walks like a duck, talks like a duck, but the duck is not necessarily waddling the way it should because the EEG is normal. It's a routine EEG, and we know that there's limitations to what the sensitivity is. There would never, ever be a time that I would get a denial of saying that this patient doesn't have a seizure disorder because they don't have a diagnostic EEG, and so you can't treat it. And part of that is driven by it's viewed as a life-threatening condition, but as we've described earlier, although it's not a terminal condition to have narcolepsy, it is life-threatening. It threatens every single aspect of their life. And our current diagnostic modalities are extraordinarily limited, both in terms of their sensitivity and specificity, but also access. And so what we now encounter is that many times we are unable to treat someone until after they have not only the testing done, but it has to fulfill the specific diagnostic criteria, which I think people have heard is kind of erroneous at this point. there had been a discussion around other proposals of saying, well, can we use some clinical paradigms? Can we rely on the DSM-5? Can we do other strategies to be able to kind of minimize this barrier? Because as we had already alluded to, not being diagnosed increased costs of care, and the greater delay from time of being seen by a specialist to getting a diagnostic test can lead to more misdiagnoses, more inappropriate medications, more exposure to risk. What are your thoughts around what would be acceptable models to be able to help people before or even without having to go through very specific diagnostic testing as we see in other disease states?
Okay, so I'll take this. I think the onus is on some combination of the medical community and the academic leaders who write the treatment guidelines. And so you described earlier some differences in geographies, in the
US
EU
versus European, yeah.
Yeah. And anytime you see that you have to kind of scratch your head a little bit. We're all made of the same stuff, that is, people, and we probably aren't manifesting disease all that differently across the Atlantic Ocean from one another, and so one should recognize that the payers are sort of the tail here, and the brain is in academia and in the policy centers. And it's not to say that there aren't multi-stakeholder meetings that occur where people work through these things. It's noble work, guideline writing. I'm sure you've sat on some guideline writing committees, and so much of the effort is voluntary. I did a quick check and looked like the AASM guideline in particular was from 2014.
So the most recent one was just revised in 2021, and the one before that I think was actually 2007. And so that's also something that we've asked within the American Academy of Sleep Medicine. How frequently should these be updated? Because if we're using old guidelines, then it's not going to be helpful. And I think one of the things that you're acknowledging is that what the guidelines do is actually just tell us, is data good enough to treat this certain thing? But it doesn't actually give us guidelines as to when to use the medication. So the current paradigm specifically in this disease state is you have something like the International Classification of Sleep Disorders Edition 3 text revision that says this is the approach to diagnosing this condition. Then you have guidelines that go, if you have this condition, you can utilize these types of medications. And then you have separately the DSM-5 TR that says you can also use this book. And you're correct of that these patients might show up in a variety of different doorsteps and therefore be diagnosed in different ways. And the challenge is that there's not necessarily this uniform. So what I'm hearing is that now gives an opportunity for someone looking at this disarray to then apply their own interpretation as to when we can actually say that this person has a condition or not.
Which could be problematic, or I would argue is problematic.
Definitely.
So, and this is not, and this is across all medical specialties. We see this. So we live in this, fantastic age of innovation, and yet we still have disorders that, well, and to some extent, the more we know, the less we know. We realize that there are subtypes of diseases, and there are epigenetic issues that affect the way that disease manifests. So we're on this constant learning journey, and then it is a real challenge with the rate of information flow to actually establish what are the best practices at any point in time. But I think that it is incumbent upon the stakeholders to sort of come together and say, all right, what is the best practice as we might define it? We're not the greatest thought leaders in the room. You're not going to have 100% concordance in all their opinions. We know that, and that's where you end up with consensus statements. So and those are the kinds of things that can then be use the word not to be pejorative, but can be prosecuted against policies that are then established that relate to what gets paid for.
Yes.
And the industry, whether it's governmental or private commercial coverage, is not so much in the business of establishing that database. We really look to the academic leaders to help us with that.
Sure.
And so when it's vague, that ends up frustrating everyone. So I think that's kind of, I think there's more. I can't really answer your question as what good should be, because that's not my expertise.
Sure.
What I can tell you, in any management program that I've ever created from the vendor side or inside of payers, I have always had an expert panel in the field who was helping to assure that whatever management principles we were applying, that we were current, and we would meet on a regular basis. And I think this is a best practice in the management world, to bring in unbiased consultants who are leaders in their field to say, are we doing the right thing? Are we hurting anyone? And what I'm seeing in this area is something of a disarray of what characterizes a diagnosis. And I think there's consensus around the fact that we don't want that. We want, in the shortest period of time, to get people to the right diagnosis. I'm also hearing that that doesn't necessarily mean, and I'm married to a pediatrician, that the primary care physician should be the one to sort of getting treatment started. I think there are other technologies that can help augment the performance of the primary care physician with regard to subspecialties, and there are ways of linking networks. I'm sure you're working on some of these kinds of things where specialists are able to extend themselves in a more automated way and in an audible way to sort of help fill that knowledge gap, I should say.
And I think the point that Ross is making is really critical about the payer's role in this. And ultimately, we always talk about the payer's role being around financial stewards of limited dollars, but there's also a quality component and accreditations around quality. And so in every single category, what a payer always does, not typically, always does, is what Ross described, is you'll have a panel of key opinion leaders, you have an independent body primarily looking at guidelines and saying, okay, what should the coverage policy look like? And then you look at just procedurally, you then look at the if it's drugs, the therapies available, and you rank what has to absolutely be covered, what can be covered but has an alternative, a clinical alternative, and then and only then does cost become part of the conversation. And so if there is a policy at a payer, for example, at our company, we have the primary care can prescribe, but only in consultation with a sleep specialist, and you have to try and fail one generic. It's not a duration. It's not. It has to be a year or 6 months. It's just you have to try and fail, and then you can move to branded agents. That is reviewed by these experts against guidelines and then voted on and viewed as clinically appropriate. And so Ross's point about if guidelines need to change, that has to come from the academic community and it has to be data driven. And ultimately the cost conversation comes after the clinical, and the cost conversation is in that a generic treatment is $1,000 a year and a branded treatment is $100,000 a year. That's a real issue. It's 100 times more expensive. And so you want to make sure that you're not being wasteful in the treatment, and that's the process by which we do. We rely very heavily on the academic community. So
when looking at just some of the current policies, because this is actually a really important piece, because I think a major action item is for us to be able to go back to Sleep Research Society, American Academy of Sleep Medicine, and be able to stack hands on what is it that we're conveying, that there's such a discrepancy between what our clinical practices are and then what the perception of the barriers from getting things paid for and getting patients to treatment as quickly as possible. And some of the barriers that I've seen have included things like utilizing clinical trial design as criteria for utilizing certain medications. So the trial had designated a certain number of episodes of cataplexy, and therefore that now have become the standard. Are you having that many cataplexy a week? If not, you can't get this medication. I've also seen where kind of a discouragement of polypharmacy. If the patient gets this drug, they can't be on any other drug. And I think you've heard that that's not necessarily the parameters. So if you were to give an instruction manual for the academics in the room as to what can we do tonight, guys, okay, after the gala, what can we do to be able to facilitate the development of something, whether it's a white paper, peer-reviewed journal, a consensus statement, whatever, what is it that would be the most meaningful, impactful to be able to facilitate the changes or at least have this conversation further so that we can finally see action that actually creates an alignment and, to your point, is also fiscally responsible, but also, as we stated earlier, personalized to what is that person's profile. Because sometimes there are not the check boxes for the person I get on the phone where I'm like, yeah, she's trying to get pregnant. Yeah, she's this. No, she can't take that. Well, that's not on my check boxes. So how do we be comprehensive in this and collaborative in this and also continue to generate the data that is showing that this is working, right? I'm a big fan of research, quality improvement, making sure that I'm not doing things that are just for feel goods, but there actually is substance there. So what would you give us as instructions? And someone take notes. I think Emily's doing that in the back, right? Okay, good.
Well, this harkens back to my comments about it sounded like we weren't 100% in coherence there around gold carding. So the notion would be that there's a clinical review team that is responsible for updating their policies. And this occurs with some periodicity, and which is generally established through governance within their organization. So there might be some variability there, but it exists. And so where there is a group of clinical and academic leaders who have, you got to have data. I mean, you know this. If you modify your practice and you say, in my experience, I treat patients with this phenotypic presentation, a particular manner, and my patients do better, and I've changed my personal practice. That might float pretty well with the doctors who are consulting with you because they know you and they trust you, but that doesn't really fit our definition of data. What we really need, and in this era, this is completely doable, where there's record keeping that is structured in such a way that you're able to analyze different practice patterns and look at relative successes of treatment. You need to be patient. It's going to be hard to kind of build these efficiencies because from my perspective and what I'm learning here, including just in the first hour, is that there is a diversity of presentations, and therefore the number of nodes in sort of the data analysis are going to be greater. The N is relatively small in this disease state, and so finding those common threads of best practice to particular phenotypic archetype is going to take more time because it's going to take that amount of time to sort of prove the thesis. But so I think it's grunt work to sort of codify the information in one's clinical practice and actually track how one's patients are doing. And this is a lauded goal across all of chronic disease. So I mean, can you go into the average family practice doctor's office or internist and say, how are your diabetics doing? Whose A1C is in control? What percentage of your diabetics have their A1Cs in control? You think the average family doc or internist can actually answer that question? No. Should they be able to? Yes, of course. Is the data there? Yes. So then why aren't they doing that? And so the answers are pretty obvious and somewhat complicated, but I think really sort of going back to base principles as clinicians and saying we need the evidence to sort of show that our practices are more efficient. There is no payer that is, all payers will be in favor of more rapid access to care and shorter period of time to the right diagnosis and shorter period of time to the right treatment or combinations of treatments. The unfortunate reality is when you look at all of the data and the diversity of practitioners, and I think another element that actually could practically be born out of this is if you're able to construct a best practice around referral pattern. So short of a gold card with a payer, which is sort of an administrative function, but if you were able to say, we as a group feel like the best practice when considering this disease state is a list of practitioners. And in a competitive market that isn't always necessarily well received, everybody wants to be an expert in whatever they say they are in. But I think we see this with advocacy groups where they do have relationships with centers and then they can help cultivate those networks. And I think the other thing to build upon is the brotherhood and sisterhood that exists within practitioners. I mean, we go into a field because we're motivated to help a population, and there's something about disease states that sort of makes sense to us that we want to work within it. And then we have a community of people. So how do you leverage that community in a way that you're able to propagate more of that information? And Ray talked about more education all through the channel. And I think taking advantage of the points at pharmacy and being able to come up with data feeds where the information that is known at the pharmacy is known in the rest of the clinical delivery system, so that's propagated back, because sometimes we see that can be a silo, and it can be a point of frequent contact with patients that doesn't necessarily always end up getting transferred into other places efficiently, because everybody's busy. So I think there are opportunities there. That's not a clear, crisp answer, though, I know.
So in regards to the treatment of these patients, there is obviously a diversifying kind of amount of different medications that are coming into play. We're seeing that increasing number of stimulants. I mean, there's now like over 30 different formulations of just traditional stimulants. There is the alerting agents, and so we have 4 different alerting agents, and now we have 3 different categories of oxybate medications, and also a generic version of one of them. And so we're anticipating that we're going to have orexin agonists probably within the next few years that will be on the market as well. How is it that we should be thinking about preparing for, as you all have mentioned, what are the right metrics of showing the success? What is the data that we need to have? What is the strategy to justify which medications should be for which patients? Because to your point, these are diverse phenotypes, and then there are other layers that play into it. So, because this is going to go, I think, into that paper that we're going to write later, guys, of what is it that we need to start preparing for? Because, again, it can be expensive to treat these patients, but also the earlier we more optimally treat them, the more inexpensive their care is lifelong, because they're able to regain all aspects of their life. So I think that's part of the challenge, is really kind of thinking through those pieces and recognizing that there is a lot of conversation, even from a legislative perspective, around prices and all the different players. So what are some thoughts around how we can start planning forward for that, and what can our partners in pharmacy be able, in the pharmaceutical space, be able to help us with? And just thinking through it from not only I can select the right patient, I can prescribe it, maybe I get it approved, but for Ray, I can't get it into their hands. I mean, we saw that last year. Last year was horrible, where we had major crisis in being able to get treatment for patients. And they would go to like multiple pharmacies, and they would be like, I just am gonna go without it until someone tells me they have it, because I feel like a drug seeker. And so they're avoiding it. So help me think through how to solve or plan for this future landscape?
It's a loaded question. When I think about it, I led a P&T committee at a payer many years ago. And when I look at the amount of payers there are, the amount of PBMs, even if you have some good clinical information, that doesn't mean that every P&T committee is going to make the same decision. So I think where you see physician frustrations often is that there's different policies for different patients, right? So I think that's a more global issue that we have to solve for some uniformity there. I think it also, clinical trials can impact payer policy. Can we create a clinical trial, whether it's even maybe a phase 4 trial with different products and drugs, and determine, is there an appropriate, I know you talked a little bit about step therapy going through a generic or through a brand. It's easier said than done. When you have so many classes of drugs, I don't have the solution, but I think there are smart people in different P&T committees that can put these kinds of policies, whether it's step edit, prior authorization, or what have you. But I think the most important thing is that it makes sense to a physician and a patient and a pharmacist so that they can actually navigate that space, right? So that if they know the patient is, they can actually advocate for the patient if they believe the patient's going through that process, even if it's not showing up electronically. So I think it's a multifaceted approach, and it would take a nice committee to sit down and look at all of the players in this space and determine what is the best way forward for these patients. But a smart P&T committee can set policy that many PBMs or payers can adhere to. But it's very complex, and I'll turn it to you both. I know you have a lot of payer experience.
So unifying the diagnostic criteria, particularly if there's a diagnostic, if there's an aspect to the criteria which is felt to identify with some precision a particular diagnosis. So the use of lumbar puncture was mentioned earlier, for example. So one might surmise that based upon a specific diagnostic workup and results that could then qualify, and this could be studied, could qualify as criteria warranting, passing through other steps and moving straight to a particular drug, whether that's a brand or generic, just in the particular class that currently is second or third tier. And as we add more drugs, we end up with additional tiers, right? And we see this all over oncology. And the challenge in the existing world or in these disease states is, well, how does something move from, fourth to initial therapy? Generally speaking, the experience is when we have better diagnostic tools that are able to identify that this subset of patients with certain genetic markers or other biometrics are actually super responders. So I think there's more work to be done there. The other piece here, I think, which is really critically important, is health plans and PBMs and the government itself needs to be a steward of are stewards of resources, and so the market entry price matters, and so when the pattern we see, and I spent a lot of time in cell and gene therapy as well, and this is just so striking. The next gene therapy that comes to market seems to be priced at or about the price of the last gene therapy, irrespective of the disease being treated, irrespective of whether there are other pre-existing in-market reasonable treatments available, vis-a-vis hemophilia, for example. And so when that's the way the pricing system works, that creates more complexity for those who want to have more access. And so if we're really wanting to drive more value, and there are folks I know in this room who are working on various aspects of the entire go-to-market life cycle of a drug to reduce that cost, if we're able to leverage those capabilities and bring a drug to market at our lower cost and price it accordingly, we can anticipate less barriers. So and we see this all the time. The market actually does function rationally in that regard. When the price is reasonable at market entry, you see more uptake. That may or may not be consistent with the pharma marketing strategies team in terms of pricing. That's not what I do. But I think as a group that's representing the interests of patients, those are reasonable conversations to have.
All right, now all is on you.
Yeah, I completely agree with my colleagues on all the points. And the only other thing I'd add is, as we think about, I'll end where I started around this value-based concept. And so I think it's absolutely essential. We talk about the nexus of everything we discussed. Update clinical policies and criteria, bring academia in, make sure that the pharmacies are properly trained to treat these patients, make sure the payers' guidelines are up to date. At the end of the day, it's all about the outcome. The bottom line is clinical outcomes and total cost of care. Total cost of care is important, but also that the patient's doing well. That has to be a part of the conversation. Sure. It has to come back, and there has to be skin in the game. In most cases, the financial component of skin in the game sits with the payer. And I think moving and sharing risk with the pharmaceutical manufacturers as well as the providers is a really important way to align incentives. It's not just about the financials, but it's just ensuring that there's skin in the game for everyone to be rowing in the same direction and driving to the same outcome.
Yeah. And so one final question that I want to ask you guys, it really is around supporting success, right? I think that this has been a very, very, very good conversation around what opportunities exist. And I think it actually has resulted in actionable pieces that should be discussed further, particularly in narcolepsy, but I think that some of the lessons learned are applicable in other areas of sleep medicine and across medicine. We haven't really focused a lot, though, on what the patient is able to do during all of this. And many times patients do have a very active role in being able to try to negotiate it with the pharmacies or with their insurer, et cetera. But also reflecting that we're at an advocacy organization of activity of how they will also be able to play a role. I know that there are organizations like Inquisitive Health, for instance, who they train peer mentors, and they have research, NIH-funded research, and they also have worked with some of the insurers of demonstrating that training a peer to be an additional bandwidth extension can improve adherence, can improve outcomes, can do these types of things. And so I do think in order for us to really transform healthcare, we have to think of these other unique pieces, because that will drive at a greater likelihood of an unbiased registry, right? People who participate in research and registries generally are a very select population, so you're not usually getting the full picture. So what do you anticipate an advocacy organization like Wake Up Narcolepsy, or patients on a journey, or who are living successfully with whatever the chronic disease, and obviously we're talking about narcolepsy today, what can they do to help us in facilitating a forward trajectory on some of the points that we've discussed today?
Ross,
Okay.
I'll ask you to do
They're all like, you do it.
So I'll take kind of a binary approach. So, I think everyone here knows that FDA has included the voice of the patient in their reviews of approvals of drugs and so on. So I think patient stories matter, and at that level and at every other level. And then the question is how you want to apply them. I'd probably take sort of best case and worst case stories and study several of those and identify the key messages that are coming up in both of those, which then lead to actionable kinds of interventions. When it's the bad view of the orphan journey, the diagnostic cascade, call it whatever you want, right? Identify those key elements that you say this should never happen. And calling back to some of my comments earlier about sort of the power of 30 to 40 million people with orphan and rare diseases, say we are all living this experience, and here's what's happening here. I think that if you can identify those elements and you're sounds like an expert communicator, and communicate that to key stakeholders across the way, from policy setting to payment, et cetera, then, and from a drug development point of view, I think that's important. And then do some of the opposite, which is saying, well, what does good look like? There are people who have had successes along the way. What's that about? And how do you find the key components of that you think are able to be copy and pasted into other patient experiences or other physician experiences, and sort of take what those elements are and then propagate those in places where they're going to have the most impact?
Awesome. Do any of you have any other thoughts?
Yeah, I think as an advocacy group, I think it's really important that, and Pharma would probably work with you. I'm sure you work with Pharma quite often.
No.
To actually,
I'm just kidding.
Okay. I think about it. Patient expectation and physician expectation are so important and key to that overall process. The ability to actually create a pathway for a patient to understand before they go into a certain therapy and a certain journey is really important. And I think Pharma can assist you from a payer perspective in understanding that landscape. What is the typical patient on a WAKIX or a product experience when they get their first prescription? Is there a barrier for first fill due to step edit or prior authorization? What's the difference between getting Lumryz covered or WAKIX or one of the new products? I think Axsome's going to have a product at some point in time. I think that expectation that can be set with a patient proactively can reduce some of the frustration. Will it be perfect? No, because all the P&T therapies and the payer policies are different. But many times patients are just, physician sends a script in, they have no expectation of what they're going to see. And the reason why I see this all the time, we have 253 limited distribution drugs. Some drugs with as few as 150 patients nationwide, some with thousands of patients. And the experiences are so different. And patients invariably will come in and have no idea that they're going to have to wait 7 days, 14 days, 30 days to overcome a therapy. And maybe setting that expectation up front so they don't get frustrated. Not 30 days is going to frustrate you, but if you understand that this is a process and it takes time, that may allow a patient to get on therapy and be a little bit more patient rather than throw their arms up and not use it. That's my simplistic approach, but I just see it so much with patients not having any idea or any expectation of what they're going to see when they get a new therapy.
Yeah, and I'd only add that I think the patient stories and patient experiences are so powerful, and I think amplifying patients' voices and experiences, I think create the right environment for the right conversation. And keep doing what you're doing. I mean, events like this today, I've been here for 2 hours. I've learned more in these 2 hours about this condition and about some of the challenges with respect to broadly between payers and providers than I have in quite some time. So I think amplifying these voices, but also humanize. We're all human beings at the end of the day. And the care, we always say we aspire to provide the care we'd want for our loved ones. And we can all imagine, when we hear someone talk about a story and experience, we could all imagine what that would be like if it were our own child or parent. And I think that's so important to amplify that, and it'll raise the right level of awareness to get people to pay attention to it. The worst thing we could do is have it be purely, about research and policies and paperwork and whatnot. We've got to connect the human element to it, and I think you all have done a fantastic job.
Everyone, thank you so much. This was really a great, great afternoon, and I look forward to spending the night with all of you. It's going to be an exceptional night of continued learnings, but then there also will be some fun, although this was a lot of fun. Please. Thank you so much.